I'm kind of like several videos back. I still got to read the Quran, the next chapter of the Bible, these things in Tagalog. But one of the things that's really disturbing to me is people. Well, here's an example. I put in a comment. God bless. Neil deGrasse Tyson. God bless the man because he knows where he has been and he may not know where he's going, but at least he knows where he's been. And he has to be blessed because of that by some God, not necessarily my God, your God, or any God, but some God. And what I'm saying by that is that today even the past is obscure to us. I heard some politicians say that he was a Republican and he said that that Trump's rambling muses cannot be taken seriously. And the politician said basically that what they say that I said is not what I said, and if it were what I said, it is not what I meant to say. So they take that little syllogism, that little twist in the Aristotelian logic, and openly, boldly transform it, in front of a news camera. It was, I mean, when you say that off the cuff, there's a little bit less of an edge to it, and you apply it ad hoc prompter to a specific statement in a specific situation where part of the populace does not want to believe what was said. That's one way of using that syllogism, and it works really well there. But to state it as bold, unstripped, and apply it to any muse, any statement is fantastic. But so when the Republicans do that, people get upset. But, but, the Democrats do it also. And the way the Democrats do it is by blotting out portions of history. It is aggravating to see people who have benefited from a Jesuit education, which everyone on earth now benefits from a Jesuit education, and from the institution which you would call universal or Catholicism. It is incredible to see someone take a tool out of the Jesuit handbook and then all of a sudden use the God is, if God is God, why does God allow evil? Okay. Not realizing that does not negate the existence of a God. I'm not saying that there's a God. I'm just saying that that question in and of itself does not negate the concept of God. Since we know that God has a dual nature. So, and the way you separate the duality of the nature is by saying on this end you have God and on the other end you have Satan. And if you read Latin, what they say is you have the gods of Olympus and you have Lucifer. And what Lucifer is foolishness, nonsensical, disorder. Not so much a person, but as a process that unfolds. Some God tries to establish order, and then Lucifer, foolishness, misunderstanding. It undoes the order. It unties the knot, like Gorgon's knot. It unties the knots that men make, gods make, angels make. So, the Democrats criticize the Republicans for their little syllogism, not understanding that they use the same syllogism when they're in a comment section. And here's an example. Some guy says, I made a statement about, it was about Africa. And it was about, does man derive from Africa? And I'm just making a simple statement that, number one, I am a non-human primate. That doesn't mean that you are a non-human primate. That means that I am a non-human primate. That being the case, I don't have to differentiate myself from old world monkeys and new world monkeys. I don't have to say that there's a difference between us. All that has to occur in my mind is that a biped simian exists. Okay, so we know that that occurred 6 million years ago. And we know that that pretty much occurred everywhere. So that's what's essential to me. And that was the point that was being made on this particular YouTube video. The scientists, they were in Kenya, and they had found a biped tool user who was not Homo sapien. But no one in the comment section responded to the fact that the scientists said that we have found a biped tool maker who was not Homo sapien. Meaning they found me, my ancestors out there. Not yours, but mine. And then, what's his name? Daniel? He's always in the debate with Chomsky about language, about Chomsky's universal grammar. But Daniel, I wish I got his book, but I can't remember his name. And he was religious, and then he went to the Amazon with his family. His idols were broken. Daniel Everett. Okay. Daniel Everett makes the claim, and there's practically no fossilized evidence that supports his claim, but I can understand the logic that he makes ex nihilo, without datum, without the bones to prove it. He says that language, speaking literally, occurred prior to Homo sapiens. That's what he says. So at any rate, some guy in the comment section, based upon what I said, the scientist had said, and based upon what Everett had said, he said, well, you know what? You went to Trump University. And I'm like, Trump University? Then someone later down the comment section seeing it, she said, well, you know what? Trump has a small genitalia. And I explained in a comment, yes, that may be true, but my penis is smaller than Trump's. and I explained why it was smaller than Trump's. Now, the problem with the penis argument and Trump is that it's a non-argument. Because the only thing that you can really argue is not whether my penis is smaller than Trump's or bigger than Trump's, or yours is smaller than Trump's or bigger than Trump's. The only thing that you can say is that penises all have an average size of right about 5.5 inches, and I don't know what it is in centimeters. You can also say that Moroccans, on average, have the largest penises in the world, per population. Those are things that you can't say. But to connect Trump's penis with his politics is a non-statement. It's a non-productive statement. So, under two statements made about Trump University, Trump's penis, is there meaning in what those two commenters said? Or can we consider that that is not what they said? And if that were to be what they said, that is not what they meant, because they are speaking in metaphor, fabulistic, narrativo. See? So, both sides use the same escape hatch. I mean, we all do. You know, as a parent, we come down to saying to our children, and when my mother used to say it to me, I used to get frustrated. But now I completely understand. And authority figures are going to say this, and they must say it, especially when they pardoned their son, and they said that they wouldn't. She said, do what I tell you to do, not as I do. Okay? See? And so, that little principle, do as I tell you to do, not as I do. That's essentially what all people who are in authority, be they parents, be they business owners, be they generals in an army, be they heads of state, eventually, at some point in time, their personal behavior will contradict their public edicts. And when that occurs, they're going to have to make that statement for the greater good. Well, what these Democrats do is every time they want to say that anyone who disagrees with them is ignorant and unwashed. And then they always go to some cosmological argument. They go and they say, well, these people are flat earthers. These people believe in a terracentric universe. These people don't accept the heliocentric universe. These people don't understand that there's a Big Bang. And they particularly say that the Catholic Church understands nothing about cosmology. That's like one of their favorite little rants. Okay, let's read about this guy. Hopefully this will get past Google censors, but what we want to do is we want to find out if this is true. And we're going to leave this in French because, after all, this guy, he was a Belgian, and his native language was French. And I've got to read his papers in French. You owe it to a person to read what they wrote in their own language. Now, you can't read everybody. So if someone is like writing in Persian, and you don't know Persian, you can't read him. But that doesn't mean that you can't have a friend who reads Persian explain it to you. And it has to be a friend, not a translator. And I can demonstrate why in certain languages, if you use a translator, it can lead to subtle and gross misunderstandings. So you want to have someone that is a practitioner of Persian read what that ancient Persian scholar said. And then if there's any variation, or you think that the person that is speaking the Persian is adding color to it, then you have to explore that separately after the person has enunciated what the ancient author or the concurrent author has said in Persian. But the last thing that you want to do is to get somebody, well, you might want to get them to indicate what a problem is. You don't want someone who is working for the New York Times or another electronic journal and they print out, this is what so and so in Persia said. And then they print it out and then you read it and then you go before your friends and family and say, oh, we got to go to war against these guys because this is what was reported in the New York Times. That's, I mean, read All Is Quiet on the Western Front, and you should read it in German. And when you read All Is Quiet on the Western Front, you realize the snowballing effect of people saying that. It's not that you shouldn't say, we're going to go to war against Iran because of this. It's that you, as a person who is going to be cannon fodder, you know, might not want to say that. And that's what occurs in All This Quiet on the Western Front. German soldier returns on leave to his classroom, and he returns to see his much esteemed teacher. And his teacher is rambling on with the same rhetoric that he used after the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 or so. A war in which the Germans were successful. Era Bismarck, German unification. And so the student is listening to him. And then finally the student who's a soldier pounds his fist on the desk and he explains to head teacher, he explains, look, maybe that was the situation back in Paris, back during that war. And maybe that it has been the situation for the last 45 years. But the current situation of protracted trench warfare is a brand new phenomenon that you don't understand because you're not there. I am there. So whatever you're saying now and inculcating into your students, that could cost them their lives. That's what this guy says. That's the whole point of the book. Everything else in the book, you know, the tricky sergeant, this, that, and other, is basically a rewriting of the Red Badge of Courage, but that little focal point in the classroom is just absolute key. Okay, so no matter what political party you're in, when you're out there spitting out rhetoric, what you want to do is prepare yourself to be confronted with the truth, or confronted with data, or confronted with the facts. And so the fact of it is that cosmology, over the last 2,300 years has been, well, more than that. Cosmology over the last 45,000 years at least has been, well, no, let's go back further. Cosmology has always been driven out of superstition and necessity. And superstition and necessity are intertwined. So you can call it, and I was reading someplace in a scientific journal where some Catholics were discussing this, some priests were discussing this in 14, 15, or 13 something. And so the priest says he's anti superstition. This wasn't a non priest, this was a priest. And everyone in the assembly was anti superstition. They were like, they they were convinced that they were not superstitious. They were convinced. And I'm like, hold on, wait, what is this guy saying? And then I realized that by this guy who lived in a superstitious era saying that superstition was not part of his makeup, his being, his mental calculus, I realized, hold on, wait. Superstition is integral to the process. It's part of the scientific process. You can say that the person is blindsided by his prejudices, but that's what superstition means. It has a little bit more of a systematic component, but that's what it means. Okay, so if you can't deal with the fact that George Lemaitre was a Catholic priest and a Jesuit, and he was from a wealthy family, and he was celibate and not a pedophile, if you can't deal with those particular facts, you're not going to be able to make an appeal to a broad base. And if you have a voting space that is sacred, I'm not saying how you count the votes, but if you have a sacred voting booth where the person goes into the booth, he's cloaked in secrecy, and at that moment of election, he can choose A, B, C, D, E, F, G. He can choose, and he's in the sacred voting booth, and he keeps his own counsel, and his vote is anonymously registered. Now you have a problem because you can't intimidate this person inside the voting booth. The only thing that he takes in there with him are the purity of ideas. And if he discovers that he lacks trust in you for whatever reason, then he's going to go in there, and if you're A, he's going to hit B. That's what occurs. And then if well, you're going to say, well, yeah, but who can trust Trump? It isn't a question of who can trust Trump. The question is who can he trust more? If he feels that he can trust A more than B, he votes A. If he feels that he can trust B more than A, he votes B. That's why you got to be very careful in your arguments. That's why you got to know what you're arguing. You can't argue for the Big Bang and say that you're an atheist, because that is incompatible. Because the guy that came up with the Big Bang, who was ridiculed by all of the scientists around him, who thought that he was introducing the psychology of Genesis into the question, the psychology of the metamorphosis into the question. That was their arguments. Check them out. They said that he was engaging in a deistic fiction and not in real science. That's what was being said in the 1930s. Check the argument out. So if you say today that because this person doesn't believe in the Big Bang, that he is participating in the deistic fiction, in 1930 you would have been walking in league with a Catholic priest, and you would have been participating in a deistic fiction. See the problem? If you don't know that, and someone, as they say, puts you on blast during a political debate in any forum, now you look superstitious and prejudiced. You look like you are in lockstep. You look like you are a member of a cult. Then the person in the voting booth has to say, I have two political cults. Cult A, Cult B. Which one of these cults do I trust most? Which one of these cults will serve me best? The Trumpesians or the anti-Trumpesians? See, and once you get it where it's the Trumpesians and the anti-Trumpesians, you already have lost. You already have lost when you say the Trumpesians and the anti-Trumpesians. When you can't even, the person can't even go into the voting booth and say, think of this way, Coke or not Coke? What's your choice? Think of it again. Coke or non-Coke? What is your choice? Now, Coke or Pepsi? What is your choice? Pepsi or Coke? See, the Coke or non-Coke leads right back to Coke. Trump or non-Trump leads right back to Trump.
Georges Lemaître. Publié par Wikipédia. Georges Lemaître, né le 17 juillet 1894 à Charleroi et mort le 20 juin 1966 à Louvain, est un chanoine catholique, astronome et physicien belge, professeur à l'Université catholique de Louvain. Son « hypothèse de l'atome primitif » visant à expliquer l'origine de l'univers, constitue le fondement de sa théorie du Big Bang. Biographie. Études. Georges Lemaître est l'aîné d'une famille de 4 enfants. Ses parents, Joseph Lemaître, un industriel tisserand prospère et sa mère Marguerite, née Lannoy, vouent une affection sans limite à leur fils Georges. En 1904, il entre au collège des Jésuites à Charleroi. Après une année préparatoire en mathématiques au collège Saint-Michel d'Etterbeek, il est admis à l'école des mines de l'Université catholique de Louvain en 1911. Il y rencontre Charlemagne Bach, un collègue qui devient son ami. Il suit les cours d'analyse de Charles de la Vallée-Poussin et de mécanique d'Ernest Pasquier, qui l'initie aux problèmes de cosmologie. Au début de la Première Guerre mondiale, il s'engage dans le 5 corps des volontaires et participe à la bataille de l'Isère. Après 4 ans de guerre, décoré de la Croix de guerre, il quitte l'armée en tant qu'adjudant et reprend ses cours de mathématiques et de sciences physiques à l'Université catholique de Louvain en 1919. Cette même année, il obtient son baccalauréat en philosophie thomiste et entame son doctorat avec la Vallée-Poussin. Il commence une première thèse sur la fonction zeta de Riemann, qu'il ne parvient pas à conclure. Il change alors de sujet et soutient sa thèse en 1920. Afin d'obtenir une bourse de voyage, il rédige en 1922 un mémoire sur la physique d'Einstein, lui permettant de remporter la distinction. Il écrit son premier article scientifique en août 1923. Il est admis cette même année à l'université de Cambridge comme étudiant-chercheur. États-Unis, Harvard et MIT. Georges Lemaître y suit les cours de l'astronome Arthur Eddington et travaille avec ce dernier. Il rencontre à un congrès à Toronto le physicien Ludwig Silberstein qui y fait une communication sur une approximation de la taille de l'univers. Il passe l'année suivante au Harvard College Observatory de Cambridge. Cette prestigieuse université ne proposant pas de doctorat en astrophysique, Georges Lemaître s'inscrit peu après au Massachusetts Institute of Technology et travaille sur plusieurs sujets. La relativité générale, l'étude des étoiles variables et une théorie d'Eddington tentant de relier l'électromagnétisme à la gravitation. Il rencontre alors Edwin Hubble et s'entretient avec Robert Millikan. En 1926, il soutient sa thèse sur le calcul du champ gravitationnel d'une sphère fluide de densité homogène. Louvain. Georges Lemaître revient comme enseignant à la section francophone de l'Université catholique de Louvain. En 1927, Georges Lemaître rencontre Einstein au cours du 5e congrès Solvay à l'Université libre de Bruxelles. Il fait ensuite de nombreux voyages aux États-Unis, rencontrant plusieurs fois Albert Einstein à Pasadena. Il est invité dans de nombreuses universités prestigieuses et gagne une réputation dans le grand public. En 1934, il reçoit la médaille Mandel de l'Université Villanova, réservée aux scientifiques catholiques de haut niveau, et la même année, le prix Francky. Le 13 mai 1940, Georges Lemaître rejoint sa famille à Charleroi et projette un passage en Angleterre, mais échoue dans son exode devant la rapidité de l'avance allemande. Il retourne alors à Louvain et continue à y enseigner. Lors de la décision de l'Université libre de Bruxelles d'arrêter l'enseignement, car sa liberté ne pouvait plus être garantie face à l'occupant, il accueille les étudiants dans les locaux de l'Université catholique de Louvain. Dans la nuit du 11 au 12 mai 1944, une partie de ces derniers est détruite par un bombardement aérien allié. Il rejoint alors sa mère à Bruxelles. Parcours ecclésiastique. Georges Lemaître entre au séminaire en 1920 pour être ordonné prêtre en 1923. Il entre dans la fraternité sacerdotale des Amis de Jésus à partir de 1922. Il réussira par la suite à concilier ses vocations scientifiques et religieuses, ne sacrifiant jamais l'une à l'autre et prônant, en particulier, une interprétation symbolique et non pas littérale de la Genèse. Fidèle à la conception thomiste, il distingue la notion de « commencement » de celle de « création », la première étant une entité physique, la seconde un concept philosophique. À partir de 1926, il est l'aumônier d'une maison d'étudiants chinois. Il est nommé chanoine honoraire en 1935. En 1951, il fait connaître son désaccord avec un discours de Pie XII dans lequel le pape évoque la théorie du Big Bang, sans citer nommément Lemaître. Ce discours aux accents concordistes évoque un parallèle avec le Fiat Lux du récit de la création. La rupture dans les années 1930 de Lemaître avec le concordisme de jeunesse qu'il considère comme une erreur épistémologique l'a en effet conduit à adopter un discordisme méthodologique. La critique de Lemaître, adressée par un intermédiaire, amènera le pape à amender ultérieurement sa formulation. En 1960, il est nommé prélat domestique par Jean XXIII ainsi que président de l'Académie pontificale des sciences. Il y accueille de nombreux scientifiques de renom comme Paul Dirac ou John Eck et essaye de préserver une relative autonomie de cette institution, au moins vis-à-vis de la Curie. En 1962, quand éclate la crise de Louvain, il fonde avec Gérard Garit, la CAPSUL, qui s'opposa avec virulence à l'expulsion des Wallons et des francophones de Louvain. Fin de vie. En 1964, Georges Lemaître subit un infarctus du myocarde. Il développe une leucémie à partir de 1966 et meurt dans la nuit du 19 au 20 juin de cette année. Depuis le 24 juin 1966, son corps repose dans le caveau familial au cimetière de Marcinelle. Travaux. Expansion de l'univers. Selon Jean-Pierre Luminet, Alexandre Friedman de Leningrad publie le premier, dès 1922, une théorie de l'expansion de l'univers dans Zeitschrift für Physik. Einstein envoie une première note pour déclarer faux les calculs de Friedman, puis une seconde pour reconnaître l'exactitude de ces calculs qui fournissent une évaluation de l'âge de l'univers. En 1927, indépendamment des travaux d'Alexander Friedman, Georges Lemaître rédige un article dans les Annales de la Société scientifique de Bruxelles intitulé « Un univers homogène de masse constante et de rayons croissants », établissant que l'univers est en expansion. Il utilise notamment l'effet Doppler, par lequel les fonctions d'onde de la lumière des astres changent tandis qu'ils s'éloignent, donc leur couleur se décale vers le rouge. De plus, en se fondant sur les mesures de vitesse d'éloignement des galaxies de Vesto-Slipher et de leurs distances établies par Edwin Hubble, Georges Lemaître est le premier à établir le rapport constant entre distance et vitesse d'éloignement. Il fournit une évaluation de cette constante, que l'on appelle communément la constante de Hubble. Cette estimation est fournie dans l'article de 1927, mais celui-ci est rédigé en français. Arthur Eddington le traduit en anglais en 1931, mais en omettant, à la demande même de Lemaître, les paragraphes relatifs à la constance du rapport distance sur vitesse. La communauté scientifique retiendra donc l'estimation plus précise publiée par Hubble en 1929. À l'origine du Big Bang. Georges Lemaître émet ensuite une hypothèse de l'atome primitif, début temporel de l'univers. Cette théorie est appelée ironiquement Big Bang par Fred Hoyle en 1949, au cours d'une émission de radio, nom qui restera. Il soupçonne également le rayonnement cosmique de porter la trace des événements initiaux. Il travaille à partir de 1933 sur un modèle d'univers non homogène nommé a posteriori modèle de Lemaître-Tolman, expliquant les condensations et la formation des galaxies. Il étudie à nouveau le rayonnement cosmique, notamment avec Karl Stormer, ce qui l'oblige à recourir aux machines à calcul qu'il va très vite maîtriser. Après la libération, il reprend son travail et s'intéresse à la formation des nébuleuses. Pour cela, il devient l'un des pionniers belges des machines à calculer et s'intéresse à leur programmation en langage machine, puis en assembleur avant d'étudier d'autres langages comme l'algol. En 1965, Odon Goddard annonça à son ancien collègue et mentor alors très malade, la découverte du fond diffus cosmologique par Arno Penzias et Robert Wilson. Cet écho disparu de la formation des mondes, comme Lemaître l'avait poétiquement appelé, confirmait le scénario cosmologique dont Lemaître avait été l'un des premiers artisans. Postérité. Loi de Hubble-Lemaître. La métrique de Friedmann-Lemaître-Robertson-Walker, utilisée en cosmologie, rappelle une de ses contributions. La métrique de Lemaître permet d'étudier la chute d'un corps dans un trou noir de Schwarzschild. L'astéroïde Lemaître a été nommé en son honneur. Sur la Lune, le cratère Lemaître se situe à l'ouest-sud-ouest du cratère Berlage et au sud-sud-ouest du cratère Minkowski. À Charleroi, sur le boulevard d'Evreux, une maison de maître, œuvre de l'architecte Auguste Cador, acquise par l'Université catholique de Louvain est maintenant nommée Maison Georges Lemaître. Le souvenir de sa découverte est gravé sur le monument qui orne le carrefour dit « Îlot des Sciences » à l'intersection des boulevards d'Evreux et Audan et des rues Willy Ernst et du Pont-Neuf, à Charleroi. Une œuvre de Jean-François Dior lui rendant hommage est installée sur un plan d'eau devant l'ancien musée du Verre, aujourd'hui extension du palais de justice, dans le parc Jacques de Pelsener. Un bâtiment lui est dédié à la faculté des sciences de Louvain-la-Neuve, abritant des auditoriums et des classes de cours, dont l'auditorium Georges Lemaître. Une peinture murale lui rend hommage dans la ville universitaire de Louvain-la-Neuve en Belgique, dans le parking situé sous la place des Sciences. En 1995,
Okay, I'm going to stop it here. If you can hear the dog out there barking, that's all this dog has to do in life: eat, bark, and disturb me. But the Benzina, she heard me listening to this, and so now she's shocked. I mean, because she's perfectly convinced. She's perfectly convinced that I'm like limited to maybe two languages. That's what she thinks. So, and that's strange how people are. They think they'll hear you speak their language with an accent, and then they assume that they know what that accent is, and then they assume that they know what your linguistic capacity is. They just automatically assume that. And usually, what occurs is, and this is me, and that's what this is about. I mean, this is who I am. I'm myopic. I'm myopic. See, there were things that I learned about Lemaitre as I'm reading here that just absolutely amazes me. I had no idea that he was a soldier and had served in a volunteer, and worse than being a draftee, it appears that he volunteered for service. And so he was a celibate priest, and he didn't have children. We know that from his biology. But he sure did go out there and kill someone's children. And then I speculate that he produces the Big Bang to confirm the biblical theory in Genesis. you know. And what what amazes me is that I saw the Canadian physicist. I can't remember his name, but he wrote a book. He's a Canadian physicist, and he writes a book, Something Out of Nothing. And he's sitting on stage with Dawkins, and he's talking about something out of nothing. And so I write them a comment, and I say, you do realize that your theory is fundamentally the same theory in the book of Genesis and Lamontre's. So, you know, Dawkins doesn't respond to the comment. The Canadian physicist, he and uh, Tyson took the comment into consideration and changed their rhetoric over the last 10 years, 10, 15 years. Changed their rhetoric and realized that someone who believes in God, and I'm not saying that I believe in God, because the other guy who went to war, who was in philosophy, he said that when we have to look at a question that cannot be answered, that we have no evidence of one way or the other, that the best thing for us to do is to plain and simply not speak of it. That doesn't mean that we can't contemplate it inside our mind, inside of our hearts. That doesn't even mean we can't discuss it with people whom we are intimate with. But to run out on a public platform and start talking about it, and this is what he's saying, to run out on a public platform and start talking about it, that requires a frame of reference. You have to say, I'm quoting Genesis. I'm quoting Cicero, I'm quoting Caesar. I'm quoting Lamontre. I cannot personally, I'm quoting Muhammad. I cannot personally, I'm quoting Moses. I can't personally say that I have seen God or been in the presence of God, but this is what they are saying about it, and I am merely repeating it. That's the most that Wittgenstein, that's as far as Wittgenstein said that we could go. Ludwig Wittgenstein. And his preference was just not to speak of it at all. Okay. So, the neighbor, she's a mono Spanish speaker, and so she's shocked to hear some French coming out of this telephone, and I'm sure that she's gonna say, "Oh, you don't understand what they're saying, do you?" Because that's always everyone's reaction. You don't understand what they're saying. They don't understand. You don't understand. Well, here's the problem, and here's what you have to confront yourself with. You want to argue against people who you think are Trumpesian, who you think are unwashed fools, who you think don't understand the scientific method. But again, you're using the book of Genesis to make your anti-deistic fiction argument. See, now, when Richard Dawkins was confronted with this, he just didn't even pay attention to my comment. But the other two scientists who saw the comment went right out and said, well, yeah, Lamontre was a Catholic priest. Okay, okay, yeah, you're right. I can't speak of of a deistic fiction because that's what Ludwig Wittgenstein said. Okay, okay, and I'm not going to speak to it. My theory does parallel Genesis. Okay, and so what they said was the ancients aren't always wrong. That's what they said. See, because ultimately you're not talking about a theory. A theory doesn't walk, talk, eat, sleep, drink. Ultimately, you're talking about a person. And if you don't know the person that was sitting in that monastery scribing that text, you don't know his situation, you don't know who he was, you don't know anything about him, you don't know him, you cannot infer what his belief system was. So you have to give the ancients the benefit of the doubt. And that's what Ludwig Wittgenstein was saying. He was saying, I have to give these people the benefit of doubt. Now, simply because in the first chapter of Genesis it says that the world was created ex nihilo, everything else that follows can all be false. And that one statement can be supported by Lemaitre in the Big Bang and be true. So what people get wrong is just because a person says one true thing, that does not mean that all other things that they say subsequently are true. So if I'm looking at someone and they are getting ready to burn someone at the stake over, they're saying, like happens in the Middle East, they want to burn someone at the stake. I can easily say in this sutra, what Muhammad says is absolutely, positively true. But let's look at this other sutra before we burn this man. This sutra tells us that all human beings' lives are fundamental and vital, and we might want to submit this person or subject this person to more judicial process and lifetime confinement rather than extinguish his Islam. Islam means his soul. It's like the Holy Ghost. That's the argument you make. That's the argument you make. You use the text to combat the text. Because in a religious book, there will always be a rule, and then the rule will be broken. And with good reason. It's just like in law, there will be a rule. Thou shalt not kill. But the state of Texas is going to capitally punish you. See? Thou shalt not kill, but the state can. Yeah? See how that works? See how that works? So within any book of philosophy and religion, there are internal inconsistencies. So you use the book against the book. Don't go outside of the book, because once you go outside of the book, the Muslims are going to say, well, you went outside of the book, so now we've got to tear out your fingernails and hang you beside him. No, you be really familiar with the text. And the people who, you read the Hexenhammer, the people who really, really, really defended women who were basically herbalistas, and what the old women were doing that were considered witches is that they were herbalistas and they were treating illness, and in addition to treating illness like the plague, this, that, and other, and some of their cures worked and were miraculous, and that it appeared to be miraculous. That caused them problems. And in addition, they were also contraceptive. They were women who had a strong belief in contraception. And justifiably so, because if women got pregnant many times, women died. So every woman was interested in contraception. Well, most men were like Henry VIII. They either wanted to get a new wife or they were killing their current wife to get a new one. So Henry VIII was not an exception. But the people that defended the witch's best stuck to the text. They stuck to the text. They didn't deviate from the text. It's like during World War II, when Hitler was doing whatever he did to 6 million innocent souls, the people who defended them best were the people that were inside of the system, who used the Nazi playbook to save people. Anyone who was outside of the system just automatically was getting pushed into the gas chamber. Okay, take slavery, antebellum South. The people who were most effective against slavery were the people who worked within the system. Okay, I'll give you an example. Back around 17, so now remember, slavery starts about in the colonial states in the 1600s. So for something like maybe 80, 90 years, they had slave auctions. And the problem is that a woman gets off the boat from Europe, and somehow she acquires wealth. But she wants someone to work with her. So she would go to the slave block and she would purchase a worker. And then people in the community would come and would find out that she was with child, and find out that the children looked like her and the slave. And that just wrecked slavery. And think about how it wrecked chattel slavery. See, think about it. To be a chattel slave, see, and this is what Uncle Tom's Cabin is all about. See, this is what the people miss in the story. They think it's about Uncle Tom going and participating, where the girl runs off and she's running, and Uncle Tom gets with the slave owner and helps him hunt it down, and he's making all of these sacrifices for the sake of the institution of slavery. They think that that's what Harriet Beecher Stowe is talking about. But what she's really talking about is the owner of the plantation's son, whose mother is a slave, That's what they're talking about. Who goes to Louisville or whatever and becomes an engineer, and how he is basically given his freedom by the guy that owns the engineering works, but the father has to bring his son back and make his son a chattel slave. So in the midst of this, there's no understanding that the law in Virginia specifically states that the condition of both parents determine the status and the condition of the child. Say it again. The condition and status of the parents, mother and father, determine the status and condition of the child. So if both parents are slaves, then the child is also a slave. But if one parent is a slave and the other parent is not a slave, now that means that technically it can be argued that the child is a freeman. That's how subsequently you have laws in certain states in the United States that all the way up until 1968 that made it illegal for quote unquote blacks to marry non-blacks. And then that was across the board. That's across the board. If your daughter married a Mexican, you could come in and claim that my daughter can't marry a Mexican, and you could list all of the reasons why, and the judge would uphold it and penalize your daughter or the guy that wanted to marry her. If you were a Brahmin, you could go and find an Irish guy and take the Irish guy to court under the same exact law and prevail. You could, you're an Italian guy, and your daughter marries without your permission. She marries a Boston Brahmin without your permission, but you want her to marry her cousin in Sicily. You can go to court, and under the same law that said that blacks cannot marry whites, whites cannot marry, on and on, Indians cannot, you could go and forbid your daughter from marrying Carnegie's daughter, Rockefeller's daughter. See how it works? So you got to look at all of this stuff contextually. You got to look at all of this stuff contextually. You can't jump off and get into these comment sections and scream, oh my God, you're a religious fanatic. You're a religious fanatic. You don't know, you don't acknowledge the Big Bang. You don't acknowledge the heliocentric universe. You're still a flat earther. See? There's something good about watching someone like Sabrina Hurston, but there's something bad about watching her too. And she admits it herself when she says that I am a theorist. I don't have a laboratory. So when you are like avoiding all of the laboratory experiments of physics, like for example, on one channel where the guy pours water into a glass and then he lightly puts his finger up against the glass and he points his camera down into the finger and into the glass. And this is something that we all see. And he says, look, this is quantum tunneling. He said because of the refractive index of glass, water, and air, the photons can't pass. But if I press my finger and reduce the layers, then the photons can pass. Now, how this affects you is there's a paper that just came out of Spain, and I just saw the report yesterday. And they're talking about how they redid the 1950s experiment of the primordial soup. So these guys in Spain redo the primordial soup experiment, and they had already redone it prior to this. And what they found was tubules that looked like little cells. And so they stipulate that there's no magic in the formation of life, and that every time this experiment was conducted, since the Russian proposed it back in the 1920s, that probably the little tubulous material had formed, but no one noticed it. And so they say that probably these tubules are just forming everywhere where these conditions exist. These little tubules are forming. Now, certainly someone else made the argument that just because these little tubules form, that does not signify that life can be generated just from these tubules. But they're going to continue to research. So, the conclusion of this is that don't make every argument that you make into an issue of morality. The woman that went and bought herself a husband, and people in the colonial states hated this. They hated to see a woman going to the slave block and buying herself a husband. They hated it. They hated it. They just absolutely hated it. But there were men, and people seldom if ever acknowledge this, there were men like quote unquote Thomas Jefferson that went to the slave block and bought a wife or a mistress. People hated it. They just absolutely hated it. They had to do something against it. But the people that did it used the laws at the time and stayed within the laws. And they did more to undermine slavery than all of the John Brown rebellions. Like Uncle Tom's Cabin, when you read it and you have that conundrum that says by the Virginia law, the status of the parents, both parents, determine the status of the child and chattel slavery. When Harriet Beecher Stowe brought that back up, and what people don't realize is that Douglas, what's his name? I can't remember Douglas's name. But Douglas's father was a slave owner. His mother, Frederick Douglass, and people just don't realize this. Frederick Douglass's mother was a slave. His father was a slave owner and a freeman. Therefore, Frederick Douglass was not a slave. Now, he was forced into slavery, But technically, by the law, he was not a slave. See, and people forget about this contradiction. So what eventually happened is that because so many people had subverted and went around the law, that people did something that was relatively unique. Then they came up with something like the 1/16th, the 1/16th rule. See, that's how they got around it. They went 1/16th. So to show you how 1/16th works, two guys, and this is why you got to know, you got to argue only within the law and don't break it. Stay within the law. Say this video after video. Two guys are on an island. Two guys, their father, near someplace in Louisiana, their father leaves them some land. One brother receives land in the middle of a river on an island. The other brother receives land on the banks of the river. The brother who received lands on the banks of the river discovers oil on whichever bank. At the time, the British common law, which is what Robin Hood is all about, the law of capture is in effect. And so that's why you see, back in the old days, like Spindletop and all of that, you'll see like 1,000 wells all drilled in close proximity. Because the law of capture is and this is what is going on in Robin Hood. The king's deer runs into Nottingham Forest. See, Robin Hood was not an outlaw. That's one thing you have to understand. He was well within the law. The king's deer runs into the forest. But the forest is not the king's. The forest is the people's lands. So Robin Hood, who is in the forest, kills the king's deer and feeds it to his band of merry men. The king gets mad about it and comes and says, "Hey, Robin Hood, you're killing my deer." Robin Hood, who can read, goes off and tells the king, "Nope, send the sheriff away." Sheriff is Arabic, by the way, for those of you who hate Arabic. He says, "Send the sheriff away, because under the law of capture, if your deer runs into the public forest, I can capture it." Okay, so Sheriff of Nottingham and the king have to retreat, and they have to think of some new ways to get Robin Hood. That's why the people rallied towards Robin Hood and were so upset, because the king was in violation of the king's laws, the king's father's laws, the king's grandfather's laws. And they went all the way back to the Isle of Man that had a democratic institution. So the king was in violation of the people's laws. And they knew it. That's why they call it the British common law. Not the king's law. They call it the British common law. See the difference? Okay, so these two brothers, one brother on the riverbank, one brother on the isle. Brother discovers oil below the riverbank, and he tells his brother, he says, "Look, by the law of capture, anybody can come in here and put up a rig," he said, "on your island, and can draw oil out of, if there's a pool of oil under your island, they can draw it out." So they can literally suck all of the oil around your island out. And what it appears is that the most oil in both of our properties is under your island. So drill, baby, drill. So that brother says, no, I don't want to despoil my island. I look at what's going on your shores, and yeah, you're wealthier, but I don't want to do that to my island. I want to keep this island as our father gave it to us, and I'm happy here. I have enough. My family has enough. So the brother says, well, okay. Then he goes and he takes his brother to court. And he goes into the court and he says that my brother is 1/16th Negro. So therefore he cannot own that island. They debate back and forth, they debate back and forth. And finally, the final judgment is in behalf of the brother who is drilling oil off the island on the shores of the river. So the brother who loses the island says, Judge, wait. If I'm 1/16th Negro and I can own nothing, and my brother is my brother, is he not 1/16th Negro also? And the judge says, you are correct. And you are welcome to file a suit against your brother. Countersuit, if you will. But right now, the issue is the action that your brother has brought against you. And you are 1/16th blood. Surrender the island. Okay, so that tells you why you just can't jump in the comment sections and scream stuff like, oh, you're Trumpesian, you don't believe in God, you don't believe in the Big Bang, you're a flat earther, you believe in the you don't believe in the heliocentric universe. That's why you can't get in there and make those types of arguments, which in essence are only ad hom attacks. You can't make those type of arguments. You have to take all of that out of it and look at actually what is at hand.